When Najib said he wanted to emphasize cross-cultural communication at this conference, the first thing that came to mind was, well, we should cover Vladimira Lefebvre's theory, because in my view, it's the most elegant example of a theory of cross-cultural communication. Okay, so that's Vladimir Lefebvre as he was back in the 1980s. He's aged a little bit. He's a Russian mathematician, or was initially, who had worked on strategic studies in the USSR. I met him at a conference in the early 1980s here in the United States. At the time, I had initiated a project with Soviet scientists to talk about the fundamentals of cybernetics and systems theory in the US and the Soviet Union. Lefebvre had just written two books, The Structure of Awareness and Algebra of Conscience, a comparative analysis of Western and Soviet ethical systems. And from that, I realized that the Russians were extremely good at deductive mathematics. Americans tend to use a lot of statistics, but the Russians are very good at deductive math. I thought he would be an ideal addition to these East-West exchanges because of his experience in both the Soviet Union and the United States, and because he had a theory of the differences between the two cultures. He was and is a professor at the University of California at Irvine. Lefebvre told me his participation would be a problem. I greatly underestimated the magnitude of the problem. Politics interferes in science in the Soviet, or did in the Soviet Union, far more than the United States, and I just didn't understand that. However, while resolving the problem, I learned how Soviets negotiate, and I learned Lefebvre's theory. So that's what I hope to explain to you today. Lefebvre starts with a conception of the individual and says that in the mind of the individual, you have an image of yourself. But you're not quite sure about your image. Like, for example, should I be more concerned with my own welfare, or should I be more concerned about society's welfare? So you're always debating, what should be your priorities, etc. And then you can have an image of another person, and you may have doubts about your image of the other person. Can I trust this person? Is this person well motivated, etc.? Mathematically, you can express that in terms of exponents. So you have at the lower level, yourself, your image of yourself, your doubts about yourself, your doubts about the other, your image of the other. When you think about these things, you need a combination rule, and the combination rule can be either times or plus. Depending upon which symbol you choose, you end up with two different ethical systems. And from these ethical systems, you can compute guilt, suffering, and ethical status. And I will try to explain that. So that if you are engaged in a strategic exercise, you want to know, what is your adversary thinking? What do we know about what the adversary is thinking? What does the adversary know about what we're thinking? Are they certain about what they know about us, etc.? You can imagine you get a little confused over time. Lefebvre says 3 levels of analysis is probably sufficient. Okay, now let me illustrate the two systems of ethical cognition. Well, this is a little story that we tell to sort of clarify things. Imagine you have a paper castle. In fact, you have 2 paper castles in different valleys separated by a mountain. You also have paper people and a paper dragon, but the dragon has a human face. So the dragon approaches the first paper castle, and the people in the castle have never seen anything like this. They don't know what to do. So they send out their hero to negotiate with the dragon, and the dragon goes off with his arms outstretched, ready to converse with the dragon, and the dragon breathes fire. The hero is consumed, falls to the ground in ashes. So the dragon then goes over the mountain to another paper castle. And once again, the people in the castle are confused. What should we do about this dragon? So they send out their hero, but this hero goes out with a sword and shield, ready to do battle with the dragon. The dragon breathes fire, the hero falls to the ground as a pile of ashes. Now the question is, in which castle would you prefer to live? Does everyone understand the question? The first hero attempts to establish communication and negotiate. The second hero is ready to do battle. In which castle would you prefer to live? So how many vote for the first castle? Okay, what have we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, 13. How many vote for the second castle? You have to vote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so 13 to 6 in favor of the first castle. Now we know who we are. Okay, so what are the... We'll go back to this later on. In the first and second ethical systems, if a conflict between means and ends, if there is a conflict, you should be concerned about that in the first ethical system. That is, a bad means should not be used to achieve a good end. And Lefebvre says this ethical system dominates in the West. We're in the West. If there is a conflict between means and ends, you should not be concerned about that. It's okay to use a bad means to achieve a good end. And the notion is that that was the ethical system that dominated in the former Soviet Union. Now, Lefebvre wanted to gather some data to test out his theory, so he interviewed Soviet emigres living in the United States, because that's all he had access to. But that's not a random sample of the Soviet population. So he says, answer the question as would a typical Soviet citizen. Okay, and these were the results that he got. A doctor should conceal from a patient that he has cancer in order to diminish his suffering. Among Americans, only 8% agree with that. But among Soviets, 89% agree. A doctor should not conceal from a patient that he has cancer in order to diminish his suffering. 80% of Americans agree, 16% of Soviets agree. A malefactor, that is a criminal, can be punished more severely than the law requires if this may serve to deter others. Americans say only 11% of the time. Soviets agree 84% of the time. A malefactor cannot be punished more severely. Americans agree 83% of the time, Soviets 28%. One may give false evidence in order to help an innocent person avoid jail. 20% of Americans agree, 65% of Soviets. One must not give false evidence. 82% of Americans agree, 42% of Soviets. So you see there's a significant difference. Now, what is sainthood? What is a hero? What is a Philistine? What is a dissembler? A saint is willing to compromise and has low self-esteem in the first ethical system. A hero is willing to compromise and has high self-esteem. A Philistine chooses confrontation and has low self-esteem. A dissembler chooses confrontation and has high self-esteem in the first ethical system. And now in the second ethical system, you start off with confrontation. That is, an admirable person will confront, not compromise, in the second ethical system. So, in a sense, what you're seeing here is that this position is over here in the second ethical system. A saint or a hero is admired in the second ethical system, but they're not admired in the first ethical system. And then Lefebvre suggests some examples, like Jesus Christ would be a saint in the first ethical system. Abraham Lincoln, he said, I disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. So he would be heroic. Joseph McCarthy would be considered a Philistine, and Richard Nixon, who said, "I am not a crook," is considered a dissembler. A dissembler over here is Leonid Brezhnev, who was always awarding himself awards for his heroism during the Second World War. And Nikita Khrushchev is a Philistine because he compromised with Kennedy at the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc. And then Lenin is a saint. Lenin said the following: "We repudiate all morality that proceeds from supernatural ideas or ideas that are outside class conceptions. Morality is entirely subordinate to the interests of class war. Everything is moral that is necessary for the annihilation of the old exploiting social order and for uniting the proletariat." It's a very uncompromising statement. And so he's a saint in the second ethical system. Okay, so what you have then is two societies with radically different conceptions of ethics, and they're about to negotiate. How can this lead to difficulties? Well, each side presents itself as honorable, and each side interprets the other side as dishonorable. So your very best intentions get you off on the wrong foot. How did that work in practice? Okay, in June 1961 in Vienna, Austria, Kennedy and Khrushchev met. And according to Newsweek, Khrushchev behaved like a brute, very confrontational, at his Vienna conference with Kennedy. He went home with a sense that the American president was a pushover because Kennedy was trying to compromise, to find agreement. Kennedy went home knowing he had to take action to overcome that impression. Plenty of trouble followed. What followed? Okay, there they are talking. Well, Khrushchev decided to put missiles in Cuba. East Germany began building the Berlin Wall in August, and Kennedy decided to oppose the communist advances in Vietnam. Now, maybe those things would have had transpired without the meeting in Vienna, but the point is they really misinterpreted each other very badly at the meeting in Vienna. And Kennedy ordered the creation of an office in the CIA to make psychological profiles of foreign leaders and to brief top U.S. diplomats before high-level meetings. Because Kennedy came out of that meeting saying, "I never met a man like that before." He's just a completely different species in a sense. Another example. Some of you may remember UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim. In 1980, the radicals in Tehran had taken over the country, and they had taken a bunch of American diplomats hostage. And Waldheim went to Tehran to attempt to negotiate the release of the U.S. hostages. After a meeting with Iranian government officials, there was a press conference, and Waldheim came out and faced the cameras and said that the discussions had gone well, that both sides were willing to compromise. They then went in for lunch, and the video of the press conference was broadcast in Tehran. They come out after lunch. Waldheim gets in his car, heads off to the airport. The car is surrounded by a mob. They try to kill Waldheim, and he barely escapes with his life. So why were the Iranians so angry? Who can tell me? Right. He said they were willing to compromise. Well, that's an insult. I mean, you can't say anything worse than that. You're supposed to stand on principle, right? So they're going to kill him. Okay, so words, there's Kurt. He looks a little skeptical. Okay, so what are the previous explanations of the Cold War? Well, obviously ideological competition, the two economic systems, communism and capitalism, spheres of influence, geopolitics. The military-industrial establishments have an interest in continued hostility and military spending, and cultural differences. I would suggest that the cultural differences were quite severe, and the reason they were so severe is because each side assumed that their ethical system was the only possible ethical system, and that everybody else who tries to be ethical will use the same system. That's a very dangerous assumption to make. Okay, here's an example. How do you conduct a society in which people reason according to the second ethical system? There was a fire in a classified laboratory. When the firemen arrived, the guards at the door would not admit them because they did not have security clearance. An intense argument ensued. Finally, the firemen went around to the side of the building, entered through a window. The guards did not stop them because their job was to guard the front door. A board of inquiry ruled that both groups had acted appropriate. Both had been uncompromising in carrying out their duty. Okay, now, during the Gorbachev period, things were changing because Gorbachev could see that the Soviet system wasn't working, and he was proposing changes, but the conservatives within the Kremlin were opposed to these changes. And Ligachev was a spokesman for the conservatives in the mid-'80s. And he made this speech, and I read the speech, and I found it fascinating. So let me go through this very quickly. You don't have to listen to all the words. You can just listen to the music, the melody. So you have the lyrics and the melody. And if I go fast, maybe you'll pick up the melody. Today we must improve the atheistic upbringing of young people, of university students. Occasionally some people who come across violations of the standards of socialist morality begin to consider the expediency of being tolerant toward religious ideas, of returning to religious morality. They forget the elementary Marxist truth that any religion is not in any way the source of morality in the individual. It is not religion that gave people their moral standards, which have now become universal. These standards were developed and strengthened by the masses in the course of their centuries-long struggle against the oppression and domination of the wealthy and against the immorality and cruelty of an exploitive order. Communist morality has significantly enriched the common human norms. Now, when I read that, I had a vision of troops marching on Red Square. It just sounded very militaristic. Okay, here's an alternative. This is from the novel by Jean Le Carré. He's a former intelligence officer. A British diplomat is speaking to a Soviet diplomat. I once heard someone say morality was method. Do you hold with that? I suppose you wouldn't. You would say that morality is vested in the aim, I expect. Difficult to know what one's aims are. That's the trouble, especially if you're British. So the music is different, right? The way of conversing, it's different in addition to... Okay, now, so the first ethical system is characteristic of the West. It is process-oriented. It is rule-oriented. Using a bad means to achieve a good end is bad. You have to obey the law. You don't go around the law. You operate within the law. And the second ethical system, characteristic of the USR, it's goal-oriented. Using a bad means to achieve a good end is good. How many people do you have to kill to build socialism? As many as it takes. How many people have seen the movie Platoon? It's about the Vietnam War. Okay, not very many. Some people. All right. Well, in this movie, there are two sergeants. Sergeant Elias represented the first ethical system. He said, even in war, some means are not permitted, like killing civilians. Sergeant Barnes, representing the second ethical system, said that in war, the goal is victory, and any means necessary is permitted. And then the main character is torn between these two and thinks that they're battling for his soul. That's just a scene from the movie. Okay, so in the 1980s, when Lefebvre came up with these ideas, they were not accepted within the Soviet Union, and he immigrated. However, with the change under Gorbachev, they were accepted. And in the year 2000, the Institute of Psychology of the Russian Academy of Sciences held a meeting on reflexive control, that's what Lefebvre called his ideas, to honor Vladimir Lefebvre. The location was the President Hotel in a room overlooking the Moscow River. where you can see a statue of Peter the Great. And we met in this room. There were academicians. These are the most outstanding academics in Russia who were gathered around this table. And as we went around the table, each one said a few words about Lefebvre's theory. It was the most unusual meeting I have ever attended of an academic nature. That's the statue outside the window. Each academician said that Lefebvre's theory had changed his life, that he now sees the world in a completely different way. These were like religious conversion statements coming from Russian academics, virtually unanimous going around the room. So I thought this was amazing. So at the break, while we were loading up our plates, I go over to Lefebvre and said, Vladimir, what is the question to which your theory is the answer? And he said, these people want to be more free. So let's think about that. I struggled to understand what's going on here. The collapse of the Soviet Union changed the borders, the political system from communism to something like democracy, the economic system from central planning to a market, the legal system, the social, and the ethical system. What was good became bad, what was bad became good. This can be upsetting to people. It can lead to great disorientation. So according to Lefebvre, people are imprinted with one or the other ethical system at an early age. One's first response throughout life is to act in accord with the imprinted ethical system. However, once Lefebvre's theory is explained to you, it's not difficult to understand, you can say, okay, what I'm doing isn't working. Let me try the other ethical system. And you switch over and you try that, and voila, things work. I've had this experience. So what it does is it gives you a second mode of operation. It increases your freedom. Just this one simple idea. Further evidence of this, a professor returned from Russia in 1987 and said an important aspect of the cultural liberation currently underway in the Soviet Union is a quest for values and religious moralities. This new attention to values is being discussed in cultural circles in Moscow and among university students. So it's being discussed across Russia, or was being discussed across Russia. And it can be used by business people, not just diplomats. If you have more trade between Russia and the US and EU, business people are going to encounter these negotiating differences. The negotiating strategies go like this. In the West, if you're negotiating something, you find the area that you're trying to negotiate about, and you try to come to an agreement. But in the second ethical system, the idea is to be confrontational. So you start off and you say, we will never negotiate about this. And the other side says, we will never negotiate about this. And then you say, we will never negotiate about this. And then we will never negotiate about that. So you have a series of confrontational and uncompromising statements that don't cover everything. And it's the stuff that wasn't excluded that becomes the agreement, although it was never mentioned. So you have to pay close attention to what is said. Now, what I learned is that I presented a bunch of stuff in Sarajevo when I was there. An overview of organizational behavior. And Lefebvre's theory was one of several theories. At the end of the course, I said, what did you find most interesting? And they said Lefebvre's theory. And I was surprised because I thought Lefebvre's theory dealt with the United States and the Soviet Union, but apparently it also dealt with the Serbs versus the Bosnians. And the theory wasn't used in the negotiations regarding the Bosnian Civil War. But I think it could have been. So it's not just the Soviet Union and the United States. It explains the Iranians, it explains the Bosnian War. It could be more generally used. If you